Hi class, today we're going to be looking at chapter 17. We're going to be doing problem 4B, and we're going to be analyzing liquidity ratios today. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So if you'll hold on just a second. You should be able to see chapter 17, problem 4B. And what we're going to be looking at in this particular problem is to analyze measures of liquidity, solvency, and profitability. And we're going to start by doing this first video for a measure of liquidity. In the second video, we'll be doing solvency, and in the third video, we'll be doing profitability analysis. So this is the first video for chapter 17, problem 4B. And so I want to start with the liquidity measures. And there will be 7 liquidity measures that I am going to talk to you about today. The first category of those 7 measures is going to be what we refer to as current position analysis. And before we talk about current position analysis, we probably need to talk about what liquidity actually is. And liquidity just measures the ability of a company to convert its current assets and be able to pay off its short-term debts. You'll remember from previous chapters that our current assets would be found on the balance sheet. In this particular problem, they're using a comparative balance sheet. So if you'll bear with me just a minute, I'll flip down here to this comparative balance sheet that we'll be working with to find our liquidity ratios. We're going to start with the first ratio of current position analysis, which is working capital. And working capital would consist of your current assets. That's why I flipped down here to the balance sheet. Your current assets are given for 2 different years. And this problem, we're going to measure only what happens in the year 2000 and Y2. But your current assets consist of cash, marketable securities, which are sometimes referred to as temporary investments, your accounts receivable. Notice they put the net amount here. This net amount means the accounts receivable has subtracted the allowance from the doubtful accounts from it to get this net amount. We're using the net amount of accounts receivable, our inventories, and our prepaid expenses are going to be types of current assets. So you'll notice here that they've set up this balance sheet and they've listed all the current assets in the year 2000 Y2, and they've totaled them for you. You're going to need this total when you're working with your first ratio, which is going to be the working capital. The second thing you need to know about is what your current liabilities are. In this case, they've given you one group of current liabilities of 900,000 for this particular problem. But you'll remember your current liabilities could be accounts receivable, short-term notes received, not accounts receivable, that wouldn't work at all. Accounts payable. Your short-term notes payable would be considered a current liability. Interest payable or salaries payable, all of those are considered to be current liabilities. For some reason or another, in this particular problem, they did not list them separately. They just gave you the total. So you'll need to know the total of the current liabilities and the total of the current assets when you're determining your working capital. Working capital is a measure of liquidity. And to determine working capital, you're going to take your total current assets and you're going to subtract your total current liabilities from that. This will give you what is referred to as working capital. You would compare this working capital amount to what happened in the previous year. This will tell you how well your company is going to be able to pay off their short-term debts. So working capital is a measure of liquidity, and liquidity is the ability of the company to convert its assets to be able to pay back its short-term debt. So what you would do in the real world is you would measure this figure, which is the figure for 2000 Y2, and you compare it to what happened in 2000 Y1. So they didn't ask you to do the measure for 2000 Y1. They only asked you to do it for 2000 Y2. So we get this again. If you want to click on this, you can see up here, they have the cell addresses for the formula. So we would take the total of the current assets, which is on B55, and subtract the total of the current liabilities from that to get the working capital. And again, this is a measure of liquidity. The second measure of liquidity, which is also a part of current position analysis, is what we refer to as the current ratio. And when you're determining your current ratio, you're going to divide your total current assets by your total current liabilities. So in the same balance sheet that we were looking at a while ago, we're going to pick up the total current assets of $3,690,000, and we're going to simply divide that by the current liabilities of $900,000. And what that will give us is a current ratio of 4.1. Now, the current ratio is actually a better measure than the working capital of your liquidity. It's preferred over just looking at working capital. But most companies look at all of the liquidity measures before they evaluate how well their company has done. So you would start with the working capital, which is your current assets less your current liabilities. What's left over is determined to be working capital. And then you would also measure by the current ratio, where we divide the current assets by the current liabilities. And you would compare that with the years to see if there was an improvement or whether there was not improvement for this company. This will give you a measure of how well your company is going to be able to pay their short-term debt, such as accounts payable or short-term notes payable. The third measure of liquidity that we're going to look at that is also a part of current position analysis is what we refer to as the quick ratio. And the quick ratio takes quick assets, which are going to be your cash, your temporary investments, or your marketable securities. Sometimes we refer to those as marketable securities. And in this balance sheet, we've referred to them as marketable securities. So your cash, your marketable securities, and your receivables are what we refer to as quick assets. We do not include inventories or prepaid expenses in our quick assets. So it's just your cash, your marketable securities, and your accounts receivable net amount. Those three items will be combined together to find the total of your quick assets. And we will divide this total by our current liabilities. So when you do that, you're going to come up with a quick ratio of 2.5. And so the quick ratio is the best measure of all three of these current position analysis to measure your liquidity. It's the preferred method of measuring liquidity. And it measures the instant debt paying ability of the company. So it's one of the best measures. And you can see in our formula, we took the total of our quick assets, which would have been cash, your marketable securities, and your net accounts receivable. And then we divide it by our current liabilities. That's how we get the quick ratio. Another measure of liquidity that we can use are what we call accounts receivable analysis. Accounts receivable analysis will be made up of the accounts receivable turnover and the number of days sales in receivables. Those are our accounts receivable analysis, are just these two types of ratios. In order to find the accounts receivable turnover, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to divide your sales by your average accounts receivable. Now, it's telling you to divide the sales by the average of the accounts receivable. This sales figure, if your company knows its credit sales, you could actually take the credit sales and divide it by the average accounts receivable to get a better measure of accounts receivable turnover. But in this particular problem, we did not know what our credit sales are. So we're going to simply use our total sales and divide that by the average accounts receivable. So before you do the accounts receivable turnover, it's important to find the average accounts receivable turnover, the average accounts receivable amount. And to do that, we will take the beginning amount of the accounts receivable and add to it the ending accounts receivable, and then divide that total by 2. And that will give you the average accounts receivable. Find this first, and then divide the average accounts receivable into your sales figure. And in this case, what we got is 16 as the measure of the accounts receivable turnover. And again, we would be using our comparative balance sheet. Sorry, get my comparative balance sheet back up there. I have a little bit of trouble seeing the lines here. There we go. So if you just bear with me just a second. This is our comparative balance sheet, and this is our accounts receivable net amount. The beginning amount of the accounts receivable would actually come from last year's ending accounts receivable amount. So 510,000 plus this year's net amount of accounts receivable divided by 2 will give you the average inventory. Find your average accounts receivable. Find your average accounts receivable first, and then divide it into your sales. Now, your sales would come from your income statement. And since we're doing this for 2000 and Y2, the income statement sales amount would be 10 million. So I'm going to scroll back down to our accounts receivable turnover. And you can see here that we've taken the beginning accounts receivable amount, which was found on cell address C52. We've added the ending accounts receivable amount from B52 and divided it by 2 first. Find the average of the accounts receivable first, and then divide that into the sales. And it will give you an accounts receivable turnover of 16, as you can see here. We would compare that with what happened last year to see how many times we have turned our accounts receivable over. The more times we can turn our accounts receivable over, the better it will be. It is a measure of liquidity. And so 16 is our accounts receivable turnover for this problem. Also, for our accounts receivable analysis, we would need to determine the number of days sales that are in our accounts receivable. And to do this, we're going to take our average accounts receivable that we found earlier, and we're going to divide this average accounts receivable by what we call daily sales. So find your daily sales, and to find the daily sales, we would take the total sales figure off of our income statement. The income statement was up above on this spreadsheet, and you will divide it by 365 days. That's how you determine the average daily sales. And the average daily sales is going to be divided into the average of the accounts receivable. The average of the accounts receivable is found just like you did before. You're going to take your beginning net amount of accounts receivable, which really is last year's ending accounts receivable. We're going to add it to the ending net amount of accounts receivable for this year, and we're going to divide it by 2. That will give us our average accounts receivable. To find the average daily sales, again, we take our sales amount and divide it by 365. So we take our average accounts receivable and divide it by our average daily sales, and that will give you this 22.8. And so what they're saying is it takes about 22 days to recover your accounts receivable account. And so this 22 days, and I guess you could round that if you wanted to 23 days, but I believe in this problem they told you to carry it out 1 decimal place. But it takes about 22.8 days to convert your accounts receivable. And it is also a liquidity measure, because the less time that it takes in collecting your receivables, the more money you're going to have to be able to pay off your short-term debt. And that's how they do the number of days sales and receivables. So your accounts receivable analysis was your accounts receivable turnover and your number of days sales and receivables. The last things that I want to talk to you about on this particular video is your inventory analysis. The inventory analysis is going to consist of your inventory turnover and your number of days sales in inventory. Both of these are measures of liquidity. So we're still talking about liquidity ratios in this particular video. The inventory turnover is found by dividing the cost of goods sold by the average inventory. And so you have to determine your average inventory first. To determine the average inventory, we're going to take our beginning inventory, which is really the ending inventory from last period, and we're going to add to it our ending inventory of this period, and we're going to divide that by 2. That will give us our average inventory. You take the average inventory and divide it into the cost of goods sold, and that will give you the inventory turnover. Our inventory turnover should be compared to what happened last year to see if there's an improvement in inventory turnover. It is also a liquidity measure. In this particular problem, the inventory turnover is 5 times. Again, we're going to take our average inventory, which is found on C53 from above. We're going to add, to find the average inventory, we're going to take our beginning inventory. We're going to add our ending inventory to that, which is found on cell address B53. And the total of these was be divided by 2 to find the average of the inventory. Once you found the average of the inventory, you're going to divide this into the cost of goods sold, which is found on the income statement up above. And that will give you 5 times. So the inventory turnover is a part of inventory analysis, and inventory analysis is a part of analyzing your liquidity. Again, we're still trying to determine how fast we can pay back our short-term debt. So the more times our inventory turns over, the better it's going to be for the company. You want to look for an improvement in inventory turnover. That's a good thing for the company. Our last analysis we're going to look at today is the number of days sales in inventory. And we're going to do this by dividing our average inventory, the same that we found up here, by the average of the daily cost of goods sold. To find the average of the daily cost of goods sold, we'll take the total cost of goods sold and divide it by 365 days. Once we know the average cost of goods sold, the average daily cost of goods sold, excuse me, we will divide that into the average inventory, and that will give you 73 times. So here's the formula for this. And this is also the formula that I've given you here. But what this tells us is the number of days sales in inventory. It is a measure of the length of time it takes to buy inventory, sell it, and replace the inventory. It is also referred to as a liquidity measure. And these liquidity measures are all I want to talk to you about in this first video. And then next time we will talk about the next video, which has to do with our solvency analysis. And so I will see you again next time. So we'll stop sharing this with you, and we'll see you again later. Bye-bye.